Shekalim Daf Gimel contains the end of the fourth parak of Shekalim, concludes it and begins the fifth parak. The end of the fourth parak actually concludes with a Mishnah and then a brief comment of the Gemara, and then we start the fifth parak with the Mishnah, of course, of the fifth parak. So the beginning of the daf is discussing two situations where you're makdish an animal, a funny kind of hektish. We're trying to figure out what type of hektish actually applies to the animal or to the actual items. There are, again, two main categories of hektish. You could have kedushas haguf, which is an animal which itself has kedusha in its body, and it can go on the mizbeach. It could also apply to other things which go on the mizbeach, like birds or items that are used as a carbon mincha. Then there's kedushas hadamim, which is just the value of the animal has a certain kedusha, and that could also be a kedusha that is meant to go on the mizbeach, but not the animal itself, just its value. So you'll take that kedusha, you could transfer it onto a different item and put that on the mizbeach. Now, the value doesn't necessarily have to be value for the mizbeach; it could also be value that will be used by the hektish for other needs, but that won't be discussed in this part of the Gemara itself. Now, the two types of funny hektashes that we're referring to is where somebody's makdish his property without saying what it's for. We therefore don't know what type of kedusha he wanted to put onto this animal or items that he was makdish. And the second situation, which we have been discussing, is where somebody was makdish a female animal in a keva for a type of carbon that she cannot be brought for. It has to be a male animal for those carbonas. So each of these two situations, we've seen three opinions of Tanaim. The Gemara is now analyzing the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, discussing the situation where somebody is makdish stam without defining what purpose, what hektish he intends. He's makdish flour, wine, he's makdish oil, wine, or birds. So he says oil, wine, or birds, along with his other property, perhaps, or all hektish. It doesn't say for what. So the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, we had seen, is that we assume that he wants to go for ola. We assume everything that a person is makdish is meant to go for a carbon ola. These things cannot go for a carbon ola. Therefore, you have to sell them, redeem them, transfer their kedusha onto other things, and use the money to buy an animal which you'll be makav as a carbon ola. That way, the kedusha that you're transferring onto the money will then be transferred onto an animal, and then you'll use it to go as a carbon ola, which is what the person intended. Now, the Gemara is bothered by why does Rabbi Elazar hold that the bird can't be brought as a carbon ola? A bird could be a carbon ola. There is an ola sa'of. Why does this bird only get kedushas hadamim, kedusha in its value, but itself doesn't get kedushas hamizbeach, kedushas aguf, to go on the mizbeach itself? So the Gemara says it comes from a pasuk. The pasuk says Dabra Laran ve'elbanav, and it continues with Kol b'nei Yisrael v'martalim ishish mi'beis Yisrael sheyakriv, and it continues l'chol nidreim l'chol nidvaisam, any type of donation or voluntary carbon asher yakrivu that he wants to bring laHashem la'ila should be a carbon la'ila. There, from here we see that anything that's not defined, a non-specified type of hektish, is assumed to be a carbon oila. However, right afterwards it says l'redsoinchem tamim zachar. It should be a complete male animal. That's what this is referring to. Now, you may think that that also applies to birds, but the next words in the pasuk is babakar b'kosam uva'izim. So we're only talking about animals. So this rule that somebody's makdish something stam, it's a carbon ola that goes on the mizbeach, only applies to animals. A bird cannot go on the mizbeach if it has an unspecified hektish. So Gemara says it's very strange. Previously, in the other machlokes we were analyzing, we saw the opinion of Rabbi Shimon as explained by the Tanna Kama that said if somebody's makdish an animal, a female, as a carbon ola, so it gets kedushas haguf as a carbon ola. Can't go on the mizbeach. A female animal can be a carbon ola, but it does get kedushas haguf. And the reason that Rabbi Shimon said that, at least according to the Tanna Kama, is because the concept of carbon ola does apply to a female. It applies to a female bird. A female bird could be a carbon ola. And therefore, it is relevant to say that a female is a carbon ola, and therefore it gets kedushas haguf. So Gemara now asks, if an animal, a female animal that can't go on the mizbeach gets kedushas haguf because of a bird that could be a carbon ola, so certainly somebody who's makdish a bird stam without specifying should certainly get kedushas haguf, and it should be able to go on the mizbeach itself as a carbon ola. Why does it not get kedushas haguf? Hooray, the ability of a female bird to be a carbon ola is what gives a female animal kedushas haguf. So how can you say that the bird itself doesn't get Kedushas Aguf if you're Makdish it's done without intention? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because if it'll have Kedushas Haguf, there's nothing you'll be able to do with it. You won't be able to put it on the Mizbech as a Korban Ola. Like I said, the Pasuk tells you that something that has Hectares Stam only goes on the Mizbech if it's a bakar, if it's animals. Now, what can you do with it? Redeem it? If it has Kedushas Haguf, you can't redeem it. The rule is you can't redeem anything with Kedushas Haguf unless it gets a mum. And the concept of mum does not apply to birds. So you will never be able to get the Kedushas Haguf off this thing. You can't put it on the Mizbech. You can't get the Kedushas Haguf off. You won't be able to do anything with it. It'll be stuck. In order that it should be able to be used as a carbon, we have to say that its Kedusha is only Kedusha's damim. It's only value. And then that value could be exchanged to money, and the money could be used to buy a regular carbon ola. Okay. Now the Gemara refers to the other machlokas again, which we just mentioned briefly, that about what happens if you're makdish a female to a carbon that it can't be. And there we had seen the opinion of Rabbi Shimon as explained by the Tana Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, and he had held that it becomes a Kedushas Adamim, it doesn't get Kedushas Aguf. Even a Carbon Ola and the other Carbonas as well. If any Carbon Shlamim and Carbon a Carbon Shlamim and a Carbon Hasham that cannot be brought from a female, if anybody's Makdish, a female, for any of these things, it only gets Kedushas Aguf. It doesn't get it only gets Kedushas Adamim, the value, it doesn't get Kedushas Aguf, and it can't go in the Mizbech. So the Gemara wants to know where does he get this opinion from? So the Gemara explains it comes from a pasuk. The Gemara is going to have two ways of interpreting this pasuk with opposite conclusions. The Gemara will interestingly reject them both pretty much for the same reason. So the way of interpreting the pasuk that it shows that if you're makdish an animal as a female and for a carbon that a female cannot be used, that it doesn't get kedushas aguf at all, the Gemara says comes from the pasuk which says v'im kol behem tameya. Any non-kosher animal, asher lo yakrivu mimenu carbon Hashem, that you cannot bring as a carbon to Hashem. Any of these are types of animals, and the pasuk goes on to say that you stand it up before the Kohen, and the Kohen evaluates how much it's worth, and you redeem it. So Gemara says, so what are we talking about over here? Are we talking about a real non-kosher animal? Can't be talking about a real non-kosher animal, because a real non-kosher animal is discussed in a different pasuk. So it's talking about something wrong with it. It's not kosher for a carbon. It's a species which is not usable for a carbon. What's that? That's a female. And you see that it says that you redeem it. If you're redeeming it, obviously it doesn't have Kedushas Haguf. You're not allowed to redeem something with Kedushas Haguf unless it gets a mum. So you see, therefore, that if you have a female animal for a species which has hektish for a carbon that it cannot be brought, so therefore it's considered to be, in some extent, it's considered to be non-kosher. It's non-kosher for this type of carbon. What's the halacha with it? You redeem it without a mum, and that's something that applies to something that has only kedushas adamim and not kedushas aguf. So Gemara says that we reject this explanation because the words of the pasuk say that when the Kohen evaluates it, he has to stand it up and evaluate. It has to stand. The halacha that it has to stand is something that only applies to something with kedusha as a guf that got a mum, and you're redeeming it because it got a mum. It doesn't apply to something that never had kedusha as a guf. So obviously, we're not talking about redeeming something that never had kedusha as a guf in the first place. So Gemara says, okay, here's a second reading of the pasuk that actually draws the opposite conclusion. This comes from Rav Zeira. He says the pasuk has an extra word carbon. It says "Im kol behemoth tameh lo yakrav mimenu carbon LaHashem," any non-kosher animal that you can't bring it as a carbon to Hashem. You don't have to say as a carbon to Hashem. You could have just said you can't bring it to Hashem. That's a standard expression. The word carbon is coming to say that it's the type of animal that can't be brought anywhere, anytime, under any circumstances as any carbon. What's that? That's a non-kosher animal, not a female. A kosher female animal could be brought as other karbanos, could be brought as a chatas. And therefore, it's got to be talking about here as non-kosher animal altogether, and it's telling you that this non-kosher animal is redeemed without a mum, and that's the status of a non-kosher animal. So Gemara says, well, hold on a second. Maybe it's talking about a rova and a nirva, an animal that engaged in an avera with a human. The halacha of such an animal is that it gets kedushas haguf, and you could it has kedushas haguf. Now, according to you, that should qualify for the pasuk here. It's an animal that can never be brought as a carbon anywhere under any circumstances. However, it doesn't fit because it does have kedushas haguf, and you are understanding this pasuk is saying that it does not have kedushas haguf. To clarify, Rav Zeira's understanding that the pasuk is telling you that an animal which can never be brought does not have kedushas haguf. It is redeemed without a mum. That's what this pasuk is referring to. a female animal doesn't qualify for this pasuk, and that does have Kedushas Haguf. The Gemara is asking that an animal which was involved in an Avera should qualify for this pasuk, and therefore according to you it should not have Kedushas Haguf. Yet the halacha is that it does have Kedushas Haguf, and that shows you that you're reading the pasuk wrong. So on that, Rav Zera answer, he says, no. I am saying that it's referring to a non-kosher animal. It's referring to a type of species that can never be used as a carbon. It's not referring to an animal that specifically something happened to it. It can't be used as a carbon anywhere. Like if it was involved in a bear. It's talking about the species. Not the species of female that could be used as a carbon. It's talking about a species that cannot be used as a carbon anywhere. That's what it's referring to when it says that it does not have Kedushas Haguf. So the Gemara again rejects it. The Gemara says, what do you mean? The pasuk further says, V'hemed v'herach. You have to stand up the animal and evaluate it. That's referring to, again, an animal which has Kedushas Haguf that you're redeeming because it got a mum. This is the wrong understanding here. And also, it cannot be talking about non-kosher animals. That's discussed in a pasuk elsewhere. And therefore, this doesn't fit altogether. That concludes this Gemara. We now begin the final Mishnah in the Parak. The Mishnah discusses the way Hectares purchased wine, oil, and flour from suppliers. And doing business with Hectares meant you always were going to take the loss. Hectares always had Yad al Ha'alyona. They always came out on top if something changed. And the Gemara says that the Mishnah says that they would set a price once every 30 days with the supplier, and that would be the fixed price for the next 30 days, unless something changed for Hectares' benefit. That means if the price went up and now the amount that Hectares agreed to buys less supplies, the supplier still has to apply at the original price, the original low price. He has to give the full amount that he agreed to for the price that he agreed to. If, however, the price goes down and now the amount that Hectares was willing to pay gets more supply, then the supplier has to supply at the new lower price and give Hectares the extra that they would get for the money that they paid originally. Now, the Mishnah also says that if the supply got ruined, then the loss goes to the supplier. Meaning, even if Hectares paid for it, and Hectares actually transferred the supplies, the flour, the oil, or the wine, to Hectares' property, and then it got ruined, the flour got wormy, or the wine spoiled, whatever happened, it's considered to be the supplier's loss, and he has to supply new ones, because it still belongs to him. Hectares doesn't own it until Hectares is ready to put it on the Mizbeach. When it's still in storage, it still belongs to the seller, and the seller has to supply new ones if it gets ruined. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara just notes that this last halacha is disputed by Rabbi Shimon in a Brisa, who says that no, Hectares actually purchases it and Hectares owns it. From when Hectares moves it into its property, it belongs to Hectares. If it gets ruined, it's Hectares' loss. But it never happens because the Kohanim always use things right away, and it doesn't stay in storage for a long time. They didn't have time to spoil or get wormy or get ruined, and therefore that was not a concern. We now begin the fifth parak of Maseches Shekalim, parak Elohim HaMamunim, and it begins with a mission that lists 15 people who were in charge of certain areas of the Beis HaMikdash, what their names were and what their specific jobs were. The Rambam says that they weren't the only ones on each job. They were responsible for a group of people, a team that worked under them for each of these responsibilities. And the 15 jobs and the people who were responsible for them were as follows. First of all, Yochanan ben Pinchas was responsible for the receipts that people would get when they paid for wine, flour, or oil for a carbon mincha. The way the system worked was that somebody would come and he needed to bring a carbon mincha, so he would give money to Yochanan ben Pinchas. He would give him a receipt as to how much wine, flour, or oil he needs for what carbon, and he would take the receipt and he would go to the person who was responsible for those actual supplies, whose name was Achia, and Achia would give it to him, and then he would go bring it to the Kohanim to do the carbon itself. Now, the third job, Achia was the second job. The third job was Mati ben Shmuel. He made the lotteries for Kohanim who drew lots to see who got to do which job, which avoda in the Mikdash. The fourth is Psachia, who the Gemara in Menacha says is Mordechai from the Purim story. Psachia was responsible for the collection box for people who needed to bring a carbon of birds. Zava Yoledes needed to bring 2 birds as part of their Tahara purification process. They didn't have to actually bring birds to the Beis HaMikdash, they could just bring money, give it to Psachia, and a box that he had, and he would make sure that all the money there was used to buy birds, and everybody had their birds brought in the Beis HaMikdash that day, in order that when the sun set, they would be tahar. This required a tremendous Talmud Chacham, because there are a lot of different sfekos and halachas that often came up when the money was confused. And also, he had to speak many languages, because people came and brought these types of karbanos from all over the world. He did speak every language that existed on the planet. Now, the Gemara says his name was called Psach, that he's really Mordechai. His name was Psachia because he was able to Pesach Dvarim. He was able to open and understand all kinds of complicated things, and he was also able to explain things in many languages. He was able to open and understand them. Okay, the fifth job was Ben Achia. His job was to help the Kohanim who got sick from eating too much carbon meat. Nechunya, sixth job, he used to dig wells along the way to Yerushalayim for people who were being olaregel and needed water. Gavini was the announcer. He would announce when it's time to start the karbanos, when it's time to start the shira, and when it's time to end. The gates and the doors were locked at night and opened in the morning by Ben Gever. Ben Bevai, his job was the pakia, machlokes what that is. Either he was in charge of the wicks of the menorah, or he would walk around at night when the Leviim were supposed to be awake, guarding the Beis Hamikdash. If he saw one asleep, he would wake them up. Ben Arza rang the bell to tell them when to start singing and playing the musical instruments. According to others, he was also responsible for the care and the supply of the musical instruments that the Leviim used at the times of the Karbanos. Hogras ben Levi was responsible for the singing. He was the conductor of the choir. Beis Garamu made the lechem apanim. They knew how to make it with the shape of the walls that went up into the sides without collapsing. Beis Haftinis made the ketores. They had the recipe. They knew what the secret ingredient was that made the smoke go straight up and not even be blown by the wind. Elazar was responsible for the parochos. Those are curtains hanging over the 13 entrances to various different places of the Beis Hamikdash. There were 13 curtains that were changed every year. He cared for them and he was in charge of the weaving. And the last job is Pinchas HaMalbush. He was in charge of the Big Day Kahuna, the clothing that each Kohen had, helping them into it and out of it, and storing it and taking charge of it. The Gemara begins now, and the Gemara asks, look, the Beis Hamikdash stood for 420 years. Obviously, these jobs were not held by these 15 people for all 420 years. Why does the Mishnah choose to mention only these? So Gemara brings the Machlokes two possible reasons. One is that these are the best, these are the biggest tzaddikim, the most ksherim in each of these jobs throughout the entire 420 years that the Beis Hamikdash stood. The second shot the Gemara says is that the Tana listed those who were serving at the time that he wrote it. In his generation, these were the people who were serving the job. So now the Gemara says, based on these two explanations, we have two explanations in two Mishnayos and Maseches Yuma. The Mishnah Maseches Yuma lists two groups of people that worked in the Beis Hamikdash. It's actually two Mishnayos. The first Mishnah praises one group. It lists 5 people and it praises them. They're Ben Gamla, Ben Katan, Munbaz, Heleni, and Nicanor. The Mishnah praises these 5. And then the Mishnah criticizes a group of 5. It's the second Mishnah. It criticizes Beis Garmu, Beis Haftinis, Horgas ben Levi, and Ben Kamtzar. All these are criticized for not sharing their craft with others. And then it concludes and it says, on the first ones you say Zecher Tzadik Levracha, these are Tzadikim, and on the last ones you say Shem Hashem Yirkav, these are Rishayim, let their names rot. So now the simple shot is that the first group that the Mishnah is praising are the ones that about which we said Zecher Tzadik Levracha, and the second group that the Mishnah is criticizing are the ones about which we said Shem Hashem Yirkav. Now the problem is that listed in that last group are Beis Garmu, Beis Haftinis, and Horgas ben Levi, which are also listed in our Mishnah here. Now, according to the Pshat that our Mishnah listed the Ksherim, the best ones, the biggest tzaddikim of all these jobs throughout the 420 years, you can't say Shem Hashem Yirkav about them. So you have to say that when it says Shem Hashem Yirkav on the last ones, it's referring to the last 2 in the last Mishnah. Those were the Rishayim over there. However, the first 3, even though we criticize them, they're still tzaddikim. According to the other pshat that we're just listening, the ones that were around at the time that this Tana was written, that this Mishnah was written by this Tana, you could say that they were indeed Rishayim, and therefore the Mishnah is saying Shem Hashem Yirkav about those 5. On the subject of praising people, the Gemara now moves on and it praises more people, Rabbi Akiva and other people, and the other Tanaim who ensured the passage of Torah properly. The Gemara mentions Rabbi Akiva with a pasuk that says, "L'chena chalak lebarabim v'esatzuim yichalik shalol tachas u'shahera l'mavas nafshay a pasuk in Yeshaya that praises Schar, that goes to Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara says that he set up the Mishnayos, the Midrashim, the Halacha, and the Agada, and he arranged almost all the Mishnaic writings which we have. Now they were organized by Rebbe, but Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi took the Mishnayos that were already structured from beforehand and he organized them in a specific form. The authors of those Mishnayos and various other Mishnaic writings were all Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. You had Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda. Those were all Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, and he was the one who created those Mishnayos that we have. The Gemara has another source that says that it was actually from the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. It predated Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva organized it in more detail. He did Klal Uprat. He did the rules of Drush. But the actual Mishnayos were organized from beforehand by the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the Gemara now praises other Talmidei Chachamim who helped us remember Torah. Torah used to be not written. Torah Shebal Peh was understood only by heart. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Avo says, Mishbachos Sofrim Yoshvei Ya'abetz. Sofrim means scribes. It also means counters or those who have numbers. The Gemara says that the early Talmidei Chachamim set up the Mishnayos in a way that it will be easier for us to remember by giving numbers to everything. So, for example, it said that there are 5 people who should not take truma. There are 5 types of grains that are chayim and chal. There are 15 women that if they are married to a man and another woman is married as well, then the mitzvah of yibum is removed. There are 36 types of kares in the Torah. All these numbers help us remember. More numbers. There are 13 halachos about the nevela of a kosher bird. There are 4 types of categories of damage. There are 39 categories of work on Shabbos that are forbidden. Now, in the concept of a sofer, of a counter, the Gemara refers to Ezra HaSofer, and the pasuk calls him a sofer twice. It says, Zeh parshegan hanishtivon shenosan amach ar tachshas lo Ezra HaKohen HaSofer. Sofer divri mitzvahs Hashem v'chukav al Yisrael. Why does it say sofer twice? The Gemara says, first of all, there's a sofer in Torah. He had all these methods of counting halachos, like we've mentioned earlier, and he was also a sofer in Divrei Chachamim. Now, sofer in a Divrei Chachamim actually refers to the methods of counting. Sofer in the Torah refers to the nekudos and the signs of the trup, which we use when we read the Torah itself. Now, the Gemara says, unfortunately, despite all the work that the Talmidei Chachamim put in, that we should be able to remember all the Torah, we still forgot it anyway. And the Gemara bemoans this by saying the early Talmidei Chachamim did all the work. They plowed, they planted, they weeded, they hoed, they softened the ground, they reaped, they bundled, they threshed, they winnowed, they chose out the bad, they ground it up, they sifted, they kneaded, they took off bread, they formed the dough, they baked it, and we are still hungry. Meaning they did all the work, and somehow we still don't have what to eat. We still don't know the Torah that we're supposed to because of our low level. Gemara continues comparing Talmidei Chachamim in its generation to the Talmidei Chachamim before. The Gemara says if they were like malachim, we might be like humans. If they were like humans, then we are just donkeys. And the Gemara says not even a donkey like that of Pinchas ben Yair, just a regular, old-fashioned donkey with no special level. Now, this was said at the time when Rabbi Zera sent fruits to Rabbi Yirmiyah, or Rabbi Yirmiyah sent it to Rabbi Zera. He sent him figs, and he didn't take off Meiser because he was sure he would take off Meiser, but the receiver didn't take off Meiser because he was sure they were Meiser already, and he ended up eating non-Meisered figs. The Gemara brings the story now that the donkey of Pinchas ben Yair never ate non-Meisered food. The Gemara says that the donkey was once actually stolen by a bunch of thieves. They brought him to their cave where they hid, and he refused to eat for 3 days. So they said, let's get rid of this guy before he dies of starvation, and we're going to end up with a smelly corpse here. So they sent him, and he went back to his home of his master, Pinchas ben Yair, and he brayed outside the gate. Pinchas ben Yair heard him, and he told his workers, let him in. Nebuch, he hasn't eaten for 3 days. So they brought him in, and they gave him food, and still the donkey refused to eat. So Pinchas ben Yair said, did you remove the husks? Did you remove the bad stuff? They said, yeah, we did it. He said, no, did you take off Meiser? And they said, we don't have to take off Meiser, it's Demai. It's not Chayev in Meiser min HaTorah. It's just Midrabanan, we bought it from somebody who's not necessarily trustworthy, but we don't have to take off. So the halacha is you only have to take off Demai if you're feeding it to a person, not if you're feeding it to an animal. So why do we have to take off Demai? So Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair said, what should we do? The donkey is machmer on himself more than he needs to, and he doesn't want to eat Demai, even though he's allowed to, so take off Meiser. So they did, they went ahead, they took Meiser off, and he then proceeded to eat. The Gemara now refers back to the Mishnah where we mentioned Mordechai, who was called Psachia, and that he was able to solve all kinds of problems, and that he knew 70 languages. The Gemara says, wow, how great is that person? Look how great was that person's ability, Psachia, that he was able to solve problems and speak 70 languages. On the subject of speaking languages, the Gemara says that a Sanhedrin had to have, at minimum, all of the 70 members had to understand all the 70 languages of the world, 71 members, and at least 2 of them had to be able to speak it so that they could communicate with any witnesses or litigants that came before them. If only 2 of them spoke, it wasn't considered, that was the minimum. If 3 of them spoke all the languages, then that was considered an average Sanhedrin. If 4 of them spoke, that was considered a wise Sanhedrin. And in Yavneh, there were 4 of them who spoke all the 70 languages. They were Ben Azai, Ben Zema, Ben Chachinai, and Rabbi Elazar ben Masya. The Gemara now quotes 3 incidents that happened with Psachia. So the Gemara says that once Eretz Yisrael dried out, there was a famine, there was not enough rain, and they didn't know where to get barley from. There was no barley to be found to bring the carbon omer. But there was somebody there who was in Elim. He was a deaf mute, and he seemed to be trying to tell the Chachamim something. He put one hand on a roof and one hand on a tent, on a tzrif. And they didn't know what he meant, so they went and asked Psachia, and he said, is there a place called Gagois Trifin, or Trifin Gagois? So they said, they went, they looked, they found there is a place called Gagois Trifin, and they looked there, and there was barley growing there. Next incident is very similar. There was a wind, and it destroyed all the grain, and there was no grain left in the world, and they couldn't find grain for the carbon omer. And again, there was a deaf mute, and he was putting one hand on his eye, and one hand on the hole in the doorpost where the lock clicks into. And they went and asked Psachia, what was he trying to tell us? And he said, is there a place called Ein Socher, or Socher Ayin? Socher is that hole. So they went, there was a place called Ein Socher, and they found that there was barley growing there, and they were able to bring the carbon omer. Another time, 3 women came to bring birds for karbanos. One of them said, this is for a nasi. One of them said this is for Yamasi, and one said this is for Zivasi. So the Chachamim there thought that they were all referring to Nida or Ziva. They were all referring to Ziva. Einasi means my spring, my fountain, and that's referring to her Zivas. Yamasi means my ocean, and that's also referring to the blood that flowed like an ocean. And Zivasi refers to my Ziva. So Psachia said, no, they're not referring to any of them. They're each referring to some incident that happened, that they were in danger and they were saved, and they promised to bring a carbon. Einasi means her eye. Her eye was ill and she was cured. Yamasi means my ocean. She was in a ship that was at sea, and there was a problem. She was saved from that. And Zivasi means my Zev. She means my wolf. That there was a wolf that came and attacked her son, and he was saved from that. Okay, the Gemara moves on. The Mishnah had mentioned Achia ben Achia, whose job was to take care of the sicknesses that the Kahanim suffered from. The Gemara says, what sicknesses did they suffer from? Well, the Gemara said they walked barefoot on the cold floor of the Beis Hamikdash, they ate a lot of meat, and they drank water. All these 3 things are not a recipe for staying healthy, and therefore they got sick. They had digestive trouble, and Ben Achia knew which wines would serve as a laxative and which wines would serve as a opposite effect for whatever their condition was and whatever they needed. Next, the Mishnah mentions Nechunya, who dug the wells. The Gemara says that he used to dig wells and trenches for water to collect, and he knew exactly what type of earth has what type of water, where there's cold water, where there's hot water, and how hot the water is, and he was able to therefore serve in this capacity.